All right, welcome back everyone. This is another lesson on issues and debates. Today we'll be looking at holism and reductionism. Again, an overview. First we'll be looking at a definition of holism, then reductionism, then look at two different types of reductionism, then why reductionism is more scientific, why reductionism is more practical, and why reductionism cannot explain everything. Let's start with holism. Holism is the idea that when you start breaking things down, you lose information, and therefore you should look at the entirety of something in order to get a deeper understanding of it. And the one sentence that describes holism best is, "The whole is greater than the sum of its parts," meaning there is information loss when you break something down. And so the only approach in psychology that actually follows holism is the humanistic approach. And take an example from humanistic psychotherapy would be if you want to really understand a person's problem, you have to see the problem from that person's point of view. So it's a very subjective thing, right? And so the person's point of view is a summary or is the totality of all the factors that influence that person, genetic, environmental factors, who that person is genetically, what factors have caused them to have an issue, for example. And if you just forget about those issues for now, and you just look at the subjective experience of that person by talking to them, letting them express their problems, that is a more humanistic or more holistic approach to understanding something, rather than trying to break it down into its individual components. So let's get to the meat of this whole lesson, reductionism. So reductionism is exactly the opposite. It's trying to break things down into smaller bits to understand those bits better. Here's an example of how this could be done with OCD. Now, OCD can be explained on different levels. And these levels go from very high level stuff like sociocultural all the way down to neurochemical. So let's look at this. So on a sociocultural level, OCD could be just described as odd behavior, somebody who is not behaving as others. If you dig a little bit deeper, you could ask, what kind of thoughts does that person have that is different to a person that doesn't have OCD? Okay, so just look at thoughts. Just look at that tiny piece called thoughts. Or you could look at another tiny piece and say, what about the movements of that person, the physical elements? So, for example, if they have an obsession with cleaning, then you would describe their cleaning behavior compared to another person's behavior. If you could look at the environment, you could ask what kind of experience has led to this behavior. Maybe there was a trigger, some kind of conditioning that led them to have OCD. Physiology would ask what kind of anatomy do they have that is different from people that don't have OCD. Maybe their brain structure is different. Right? And you could go even further into molecular biology, neurochemistry, and say, what is it about the neurotransmitters in the brain that is maybe different? And here is actually where we find an answer. Right? A biological foundation for OCD is that people with OCD tend to have an underproduction of serotonin. So the idea now is, what if we give serotonin to people with OCD? Turns out OCD is either eliminated completely, or the effects become milder. So you can treat OCD with supplementing serotonin. And so that is the power of reductionism. It becomes quite applicable, quite practical in terms of finding a solution. But in this process, right, you have lost a lot of information. Just by looking at the serotonin production in the brain, you don't know anything about what it is like to have OCD. What is the subjective experience? What is it like to have OCD? And so in this case, it's fine because you've successfully treated OCD. But what if it's not? What if you're losing information on the way down that is actually quite essential to know? Right? So let's look at those two types of reductionisms, biological and environmental reductionism. So biological reductionism we've talked about already quite a lot. Here's a breakdown of what that could entail. So neurotransmitters like serotonin physiology like a heartbeat, for example, evolutionary factors like the anatomy of your body or your brain that allows you to think or act in a certain way, genetics, so what kind of genes do you carry that make you act in a certain way, okay? And so the practical example is the treatment of OCD with serotonin. Environmental reductionism is just looking at, for example, in this case, the interaction between individuals and how to boil it down to basic laws. And Skinner comes to mind with his mice in the cave that were rewarded for acting out certain behaviors, like pressing a lever and then getting food for that. You could break down the mother-child relationship in the same way and say the reason why the child likes to be around the mother is because the child actually likes food and it knows that it can get food from the mother. So every time the mother is there, it gets food and therefore it likes its mother. And so you can very accurately actually describe why individuals like to build relationships with each other, right? Obviously, what you're losing here is the whole subjective experience, the love that we talk about when we talk about a mother-child relationship, right? The care, the pleasure from caring for a child is gone. We've reduced it to a law, okay, or a rule, a description of behavior. So why is reductionism so powerful? Well, it is powerful because when you identified the different factors, or we could also say the different independent variables, you can start designing experiments where you don't change anything except for one thing. And you can measure cause-effect relationships in a scientific environment, in a laboratory, for example, right? And then you can start measuring and ranking those effects based on how much of an effect they have, right? And so that is a great way of inquiring about these different effects and how they interact with each other and how much they contribute to the observed behavior. Now, the counterpoint is that it lacks meaning. If you are only looking at those factors that explain a fraction of that person's behavior, you're losing the actual subjective experience. What is it like to have OCD? What is it like to have depression? Yeah, sure, you can talk about the neurotransmitters and the imbalance of them in the brain, but it doesn't tell you anything about what it's like. And that, for some people would say that's very inhumane, that's very reductionistic, is often used as a negative word to say you are so reductionistic, you are not taking into account the actual experience, right? But it does lead to a lot of positive effects, right? Like treatments. One example where reductionism fails is Zimbardo's prison experiment. Now, the behavior of the individual participants can only be explained, or can be better explained, by taking into account the interactions that the prisoners and guards have with each other. And through that interaction, you can start explaining the behavior, the emergent behavior, much better than by just looking at individuals. Okay? So sometimes it is better to go up a few levels and to take a step back and observe the larger picture. And that is something, the danger of reductionism is that you lose sight of the bigger picture. And that's where you kind of have to figure out on the spectrum when you do your research, where do you want to be? What is the best frame for thinking about a particular issue? Leave a like if you liked it, subscribe and hit the bell to get notified when we drop a new video. Download these and many more slides for free, and consider supporting us on Patreon and get access to detailed mind maps and past exam revision content. If you're a teacher, get free access to ZenTeach, an online quizzing tool with ready-to-go multiple choice quizzes and automated feedback. Make sure to use this invite code, which is, like all links, in the video description below.